Waverly was built in 1947 in the shipyard of A&J Ingalls on the River Clyde in Glasgow, and she was built for the London and North Eastern Railway to operate services on the upper reaches of the Firth of Clyde. And the specification of the Waverly was to enable her to also go on the lower reaches of the Firth of Clyde, some of which is open sea, and that was to include the ability to sail at these areas in the winter if necessary, although she was really intended as a summer boat. And hence she was built to a design suitable for going to sea. I think the specification book for the Waverly specified she should be suitable for sailing from the Clyde down the Irish Sea to the Isle of Man, although in the days of her original ownership she never made such a voyage. In 1948, when the railways were nationalised, she became part of the shipping services fleet of British Railways, ultimately part of the fleet of the Caledonian Steam Packet Company, which was the Scottish division of the railway steamers, and finishing up after several reorganisations with a firm called Caledonian McBrain, which was also a state-owned firm. And ultimately was owned by the Scottish Transport Group, which is basically the publicly owned bus services in Scotland. There was a large fleet of excursion steamers on the Clyde, but gradually, with the introduction of car ferries, these were gradually whittled away, and by 1970, I think it was, Waverly was the last surviving of the paddle steamers on the Clyde, and thus gained the accolade of being the last seagoing paddle steamer in the world. 1973, with continuing changes in the holiday trade, in particular, the rise of cheap flights and more foreign holidays, the trade on the Clyde had reached an extent that they decided to withdraw the Waverly from service. But in the last few years of her life, the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society, which had been formed in 1959 to try and save the declining fleet of excursion paddle steamers that operated around the coast of Britain, the PSPS, the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society, had formed a very close and productive working relationship with Caledonian McBrain. And the result was that when Caledonian McBrain withdrew the Waverly, rather than sell her for scrap, they decided to gift her to the society. There was a catch. They had to be paid £1 to make the transaction legal. They had to be paid £1. We have with us today aboard the gentleman who was the treasurer of the PSPS in 1974 when the transaction was completed, and he had been almost one of the founder members, one of the various earliest members of the society. As treasurer, it was his job to find the pound. Fortunately or unfortunately, the society was very short of cash. The reason for this was that in 1967 we had purchased the paddle steamer Kingsway Castle from the River Dart Steamboat Company after she had been withdrawn from service on the Dart. And they had sold her to the PSPS for what then seemed a very reasonable sum of £600. The cost of looking after her and maintaining her and ultimately restoring her to service had greatly depleted the funds of the PSPS, which was then a very small society. But heavy rain, and in particular the chairman of the holding company that owned Caledonia Grain came to the rescue, and our treasurer, who's on board today, and he didn't have to find the pound. The chairman of the Scottish Transport Group donated the pound to us. And of course in those days it was a real pound, it was a pound note. And another gentleman with us called Douglas McGowan was the chairman of the Scottish branch of the Palestine Preservation Society, and it fell to him to complete the transaction, and there was a ceremony on the 8th of August 1974 to hand the Waverly over to the PSPS. And after a massive fundraising campaign to do necessary works to make her fit for further service, she was returned to service on the Clyde in 1975 by a company established for the purpose by the PSPS. After, I think, three seasons operating on the Clyde, it was apparent that there was good reason why she was withdrawn by CalMac. Trade on the Clyde just wasn't sufficient to pay the costs of running a large, expensive and becoming elderly steamship. So in order to make the books balance, the decision was taken to make real use of her seagoing capability and take her to other parts of the United Kingdom. She ran the summer season on the Clyde, and in the spring and the autumn she was brought south. Firstly to the south coast and the Thames, later on to the Bristol Channel, and a few years later she actually, I think 3 or 4 times, sailed all the way around Britain. She went right up the east coast ports such as the Humber and Hull, the Tees and Middlesbrough, the Tyne and Newcastle, up to the Firth and Forth, and then she sailed round to get back to Glasgow, right up around to the Pembroke Firth, and has done sailing to the West Highlands of Scotland. And these programmes have continued ever since, and that is why we have Waverly on the south coast with us today. She finished on the Clyde a week ago and then steamed down the Irish Sea round Land's End to Falmouth, and on Thursday she started this series of sailings, short sailings here for 3 or 4 days in the southwest, and on Monday she'll be sailing from Dartmouth on a signal trip up to Swanage to start 3 weeks on the south coast and the Solent. The Kingsway Castle, meanwhile, was ultimately taken to the River Medway at Chatham and Rochester, and a team of volunteers was established to restore her and get her ready for further service. It was a long job. Again, it took much more money than the PSPS had. Unfortunately, the arrival of the Waverly and her success generated a lot more members for the PSPS, and that generated funds, some of which could be devoted to helping Kingsway Castle. And Kingsway Castle was returned to service on the River Medway in 1984. The Kingsway Castle is a small river paddle steamer. She's about, in length, about half the size of the Waverly. Quite a big ship of her class, one of the biggest ships that run short trips on rivers around the British Isles. But as you will see when we meet her, definitely a river vessel, not a seagoing vessel. After nearly 30 years successful operation on the Medway, the company that was now operating pleasure steamers on the River Dart, the same people who run the Paignton Dartmouth Steam Railway. They approached us with a view to having the Kingsway Castle pay a visit to Dartmouth. This, when we looked at it, turned out not to be a financially viable idea, but discussions continued, and during 2012 they decided that they would make a proposal to take over the operation of the Kingsway Castle full-time in her home waters of the River Dart, and an agreement was reached, and she was brought round, towed round from the Medway to the Dart in the end of 2012, and entered service 11 years ago on the Dart on her old stamping ground in 2013. Kingsway Castle had been built in 1924, so this is her centenary year. So the Waverly, built in 1947 at 77 years old, and the Kingsway Castle at 100 years old. We have this afternoon 177 years of maritime history to celebrate. It's actually more than that, because the engines on Kingsway Castle are actually 20 years older than the ship. The engines of Kingsway Castle were constructed in 1904 for a previous Kingsway Castle paddle steamer of almost identical design, but which had been used as an isolation hospital at Dartmouth during the First World War, and she'd been taken over by the Dark Harbour Authority for this purpose. But at the end of the war, when her use as an isolation hospital ceased, she was offered back to the Dart Company. They declined to take her back for fear that she was now a bearer of infectious diseases. So the engines of the 1904 Kingsway Castle were removed. The hull eventually finished up beached on the upper beach of the Dart near Totnes, and that's still there to this day. As I said, virtually none of the Dart ships of recent years, i.e. the last 100 years or so, have ever actually gone to scrap. So we have 97 years worth of the engines of the Kingsway Castle. The two ships, the Waverly and the Kingsway Castle, used to meet up together every year on the River Medway. Now we have this recreated here at Dartmouth on the River Dart. Now the idea was that the Kingsway Castle was leaving Dartmouth about half an hour ago to come out to the mouth of the river and meet us on the Waverly. The River Dart itself is very, very sheltered. The layout of the way the river rages is a bend. There's Dartmouth Castle on the western shore of the Dart. There is Kingsway Castle, the real Kingsway Castle, on the eastern shore. And if you actually see Kingsway Castle now, if you look into the mouth, you can just see a rectangular building down at river level. That's the very small Kingsway Castle. Now I think it's owned by the Landmark Trust, and it's rented out for holiday accommodation. You can see the Kingsway Castle there. The bend in the river there ensures that the river itself is very, very sheltered. Now, given the sea conditions today, I don't know how far the Kingsway Castle itself, the paddle steamer, has been able to come out, but we will see. And the idea is the two ships will steam together up into the river. Kingsway Castle will go alongside the quay, the pontoon at Dartmouth, to land list, and this year's regatta is the 179th regatta at Dartmoor. Now, if you just look at mirrorless on the starboard side, just ahead slightly, you can see the pilot boat is coming out to bring the pilot, but there's also some rowing boats. And these are the more traditional, older pilot gig boats. They're rowing boats, you can see, and in previous times, before motorboats were introduced, these pilot gig boats would bring the pilot out to meet ships needing piloting into the River Dart. It was hoped that our pilot would come out on one of these little boats, but sea conditions obviously mean that would not be wise for getting on board the Waverly. So the pilot boat is now just coming out, and the pilot will board at Waverly's after end.